Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for attending today's Stress, Trauma, and Resilience seminar presented by the UCLA Division of Population Behavioral Health and the DMH and UCLA Prevention Center of Excellence. Today, we're fortunate to have Dr. Amanda Goldsrud here to introduce our speaker and our panelists.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much, Lauren. We're so pleased to partner with the Department of Mental Health and the UCLA Prevention Center for Excellence for this STAR seminar series. I'm Amanda Goldsrud, the director of the Child and Adult Neurodevelopmental Clinics Outreach Program. We call it CAN Reach. Which is a community-focused program to provide free educational trainings to community providers working with individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders. Today, I have the real pleasure of introducing Dr. Erin Graham and our panelists for this important conversation. Dr. Erin Graham is a clinical psychologist working in both research and practice. She earned her Bachelor's of Science in Applied Psychology from the New York University and a PhD in Clinical Psychology and Women's Studies from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She completed her American Psychological Association accredited internship at the former National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, where she served as a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy. While on active duty, Dr. Graham evaluated incoming Navy recruits for psychological suitability for military service and later served as the head of the stress control clinic in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where she managed the mental health needs of all the deployed military service members. Currently, Dr. Graham works in psychiatry research at UCLA, managing a study of genetic risk for autism in the African American community. She provides evidence-based psychotherapy with a specialty in culturally sensitive and positive psychology approaches to mental health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Graham.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have a really productive conversation on this topic, which is really important to me. So I will try my best not to be too long-winded because I do want to get to our panelists and really engage in this conversation. I personally am of the mind that we all are experts on race to a certain extent because we all experience race in this country. And I think now we're in a time where we can really acknowledge that and share experiences, share knowledge of difference as well as similarities. So I hope to facilitate that today. But first, we'll just sort of dive right in with a little bit of a foundational discussion on the topic. So first off, I like to start by just defining how I see structural racism, because when we're talking about anti-racism, structural racism is what we are trying to oppose. And that is practices, procedures, or processes designed, with an emphasis on designed, to disadvantage racial minorities, particularly Black people, based on notions of white supremacy. Of course, this is not to deny the experiences of other minority groups, but it's just to acknowledge the historical foundation of the racist systems in this country. And this is also known as systemic racism or institutional racism, just to highlight how it really influences all of these different areas of our lives: healthcare, insurance, education, all of these systems. And so what does structural racism look like in autism research and treatment? It looks like racial disparities. We hear that word a lot, healthcare disparities, which is really just differences, but it highlights how these differences particularly impact minority groups. And so we see these disparities in ASD research. It looks like low minority representation. And this is both on the participant side as well as the side of researchers. So we don't see as many diverse participants in these studies, nor the researchers who conduct the studies might not be as diverse as we would hope. And then that leads to an insufficient knowledge base, right? So what can we say that we really know when we don't have this diverse representation in autism research. Then we see these disparities in diagnosis. We see delays in autism diagnosis for some minority groups, which I'll talk about, particular to African Americans, given that that's my area of experience. And we see misdiagnosis, so missing the autism diagnosis early on. And then we see these racial disparities in treatment, which looks like lack of early intervention. So again, if we're having these delays in diagnosis, then that can delay getting this early intervention on board, which is so important for outcomes. And then that also impacts care. So we see barriers to people being able to access appropriate treatment. And then even if they are able to access it, there might be barriers or resistance to engaging in it in a meaningful way. So that's what structural racism might look like in our field of autism. And this is just to give you a graphical representation, by the numbers of what the research might look like. Now, this is based on data from AGREE, or the Autism Genetics Resource Exchange, and it's relatively recent, a little over a year ago. And they're a pretty big database for autism research. And as you can see here, the vast majority of the research that they have has been based on white families. So that's 78% of what we say we know about autism is based on white families, which has been helpful, but it leads you to wonder about that other, what is that, 22? Right, 22%. Sorry, I'm not good at math. So this just sort of shows you just the big difference in terms of where the research has been focused over many years. And so what do those disparities in diagnosis look like? So this is based on data from our colleagues at Washington University in St. Louis, John Constantino and others. They published this article over the past summer in Pediatrics, which basically the punchline was that there are these big delays in ASD diagnosis for African American children. And this is based on a pretty large sample of 584 families, which is larger than the sample of African American families in the AGREE database. And they found that the average interval between when parents first noticed something was going on, they had a concern about their child, and they went to a provider to get that diagnosis, to see, like, tell me what this is and help me. So the average interval between when they noticed something was wrong and when they finally got that diagnosis was 42 months. It's 3.5 years of knowing something's wrong, going to multiple providers, and finally getting that diagnosis 3.5 years later for someone to tell you what you already sort of knew. 40% of these families received some other diagnosis before finally getting that ASD diagnosis. 39% were misdiagnosed with ADHD. And again, these are families who had to go to multiple providers, so they had to be very persistent. And they couldn't stop at one denial. And these are families that are insured, right? So we should be catching them. So this story, or this data, really highlights that the delays in diagnosis are largely due to issues within the health system. It's on our side, not for these families' lack of trying or lack of knowledge, right? So we need to do better. And then we see barriers to ASD research and treatment. So, those look like access barriers, which I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with, being geographic, socioeconomic. So maybe there might not be available providers in a particular area or people with the expertise to diagnose. It may be difficult to take time off of work, right? You have to, if putting food on the table for your family is a priority, you might not be able to take time off to go during the week to an assessment for your child because of financial barriers. And then being able to have that time available to do that as well. And then there are engagement barriers, as I mentioned. So let's say you make it through all of the geographic and socioeconomic and time-based access barriers, and you finally do find yourself across from a provider, across from a researcher. There might be a difficulty or a challenge in engaging with that person in a meaningful way because of perhaps a history of medical exploitation in the case of African Americans. You know, instances like Henrietta Lacks and the Tuskegee syphilis study and Anarcha Westcott. There's multiple instances in which medical institutions have taken advantage of Black people. And so that is swirling around in many people's minds as they're engaging with a professional across from them. Will that happen again? You know, can I trust this person? And not only is it that history, but there's also present day experiences that people have. This isn't just sort of focused on the past. It's focused on when you go into a doctor's office. Do you feel that compassion? Do you feel listened to, heard, cared for? Um, and then there's also who is the provider that's across from you? There can be a lack of diverse professionals reflecting the communities that they serve. You know, we hear a lot nowadays about the importance of seeing someone who looks like you. And that goes a long way. It doesn't automatically mean that you're the same, but just sort of seeing someone who does look like you can go a long way and maybe easing that conversation and making you feel like maybe they might get it, right? Maybe it's okay to let that barrier down. So how do we address these barriers is the question. Which brings us to the topic of discussion today, anti-racism, which is the practice of actively opposing racism and actively working to promote racial equality and tolerance. So there's this emphasis on active work and not this passive, non-racist stance of old. It's what are you doing to oppose these structural systems that are disadvantaging racial minority groups. So these are just some ideas that I'm sort of throwing out, you know, on how to take anti-racist action in autism research and treatment. I hope that we can discuss more about other ways in which we could do this with our panel. But one, obviously, we need to eliminate those access barriers. So geographically speaking, we need to maybe bring the research to these families who need it most, bring the research and the treatment to people where they are. We see this with, you know, the COVID vaccine nowadays. They're setting up like these shops that are in neighborhoods where people can access it on their way to work or, you know, to the grocery store, so that it's not so remote and far away and hard to access. You know, as far as the socioeconomic access barriers, maybe providing compensation, obviously, for research and to make it easier to take that burden of missing out of work, perhaps. And then, you know, eliminating the time barrier. We might need to provide more flexible scheduling options, you know, weekend hours, after hours, right? So that people can get to these assessments and services after work in a way that's convenient for them. Then we need to commit to workforce diversity. And by commit, I really mean, you know, no tokenism, obviously. It can't just be one or two, you know, people of color in your clinic or in your research study, right? It has to be this commitment to really fostering an ethnically diverse environment. And then that can't just be in recruiting people, right? Because then we say, okay, well, we just need to get more people of color. Well, then when you get them, are they well received? Are these conversations about their experiences being had? Are they trained and mentored and supported in that environment? So we really do have to commit in a meaningful way to diversifying the workforce. We need to improve access to autism diagnosis and treatment. I always wonder, why is it so hard to get an autism diagnosis? Why did these families, as I referenced earlier, have to visit multiple providers? So we need to make ASD diagnosis less exclusionary and the services less exclusionary. It almost feels like there's a gatekeeper to these diagnoses when again, these parents know. So we need to sort of acknowledge and appreciate that knowledge that they have. And maybe reduce the reluctance that some providers have to diagnose. I've heard that as well, that maybe some primary care providers, they don't want to call it that. They want to, refer to a specialist, which is all fine and good. But again, time is ticking and time is of the essence. So maybe we might need to expand who's qualified to diagnose this condition, and not holding it so close to the vest. And then I think a huge part of taking anti-racist action is in practicing cultural humility. And I know that might be I don't know if it's a loaded word, but I want to sort of unpack it a bit. And, what I mean by that is, it's focusing on this personal reflection, engaging in sort of a self-awareness of one's own experience. When I talk about, us all being experts on race to a certain extent, because we all have it. We all have these experiences to share with one another. And I think that by acknowledging maybe those differences, we can also find a shared humanity, things that we have in common, and that can help us to connect. And it's an emphasis on an ongoing process, right? So it's not like, oh, well, now I know all of the things to say or not to say, and I am officially competent and ready to go out there. It's an ongoing process that requires ongoing conversation and courage, quite honestly, to have these discussions about race, to acknowledge the elephant in the room, because it's there no matter what. And in fact, not acknowledging race and racist experiences is to perpetuate that structural racism. And then one more note about this, I want to just sort of make a commentary on, right now I hear a lot of people saying, well, I need to listen. Now it's time to listen. And that is important for sure. But I also think it's important to ask, because I think too often, racial minorities are burdened with the obligation to have to be the ones to initiate this conversation. And so I think it takes courage to ask, I wonder if you might be experiencing something based off of race. This is my experience. I wonder if your experience might be similar or different. Share that with me. Open up that door. Let them know that this is a safe space to talk about these things, because we know that they're operating, whether we talk about them or not. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Goldsroot to introduce our panelists. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Erin. That was a wonderful primer for this discussion. Really, I think gets us all thinking about how we can be more active in our intentions around this topic. So I have the pleasure of now introducing our 4 panelists who are going to have a dialogue with Dr. Graham about some of these important issues. Dr. Amber Angel is an assistant professor in the Mrs. T.H. Chan Division of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at the University of Southern California. Her research focuses on understudied and underserved groups of individuals on the autism spectrum, including Latinx children, girls and women, and LGBTQ adolescents and adults. Next, we have Sue Lee, who is a PhD candidate researcher at the UCLA Center for Autism Research and Treatment and part of the Human Development and Psychology program at UCLA. Sue works with autism researchers across the country through the Autism Intervention Research Network on behavioral health. As an immigrant from Korea, Sue serves as a cultural broker between researchers and Korean community, managing translations and cultural adaptations for Korean-speaking families to access autism information. Recently, Sue established a special education research advocacy and consulting LLC, providing research-based special education consulting and advocacy services for families. Next, we have Stephanie Keeney Parks, who is a doctoral student at UCLA in the Department of Anthropology, where she studies psychological and linguistic anthropology. Stephanie's research centers on the everyday lives of Black parents who have children with autism. She's also interested in the process of diagnosing a Black child with autism and the healthcare disparities these families face, as well as in centering the Black parent's narrative and experience as an expert to decenter white ideologies on health, healthcare, disability, and Black culture. Her research stems from her experience as a Black woman, wife, and mother of 2 children. Stephanie's oldest child is diagnosed with autism, and her family and research are featured in an award-winning documentary, In a Different Key. Sorrel Markowitz is a licensed clinical social worker and early childhood specialist who has worked in the field of behavior management and autism since the early 1970s. Sorrel recently retired from a 31-year career at the Westside Regional Center, where she facilitated the Westside Regional Center Learning Collaborative and participated on a multidisciplinary team that provided medication evaluation and review with the MPI clinic at UCLA. Sorrel continues to provide support and information on resources to families and collaborates with service coordinators at the regional center, as well as education agencies, community agencies and organizations, and behavior providers to create and provide appropriate, effective services for individuals with developmental disabilities. Please join me in welcoming our fantastic panel and Dr. Graham.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Once again, I'm excited for a fruitful conversation. And so I guess the first question that I wanted to maybe throw out to everybody, I mean, you all have such a diverse body of work, and obviously it's within these ethnic minority communities. And so, you know, there are ways in which you guys are already engaging. I mean, you have to be working with these communities in anti-racism in your work. And, you know, when people come to these talks, they want to know like some practical tips, right? Like, how do I do this, right? I'm on board, I get it, it's important, and I want to do something. What are some of the things that they can do? How are you all in your work engaging anti-racist action in these communities that need it most? And as I mentioned before, it's just sort of open for anybody to sort of chime in. I'd love to hear from all of you though. Or I can call on somebody.
I don't mind starting. Thank you so much, Dr. Graham. You know, I am by no means an expert, but I'm excited today to share what I'm learning and what I'm in the process of kind of practicing and trying to build in terms of my research. So the best way I know and have been taught and trained to practice anti-racism in my research is to really seek out to have the input of people who are impacted by my work in the research process. So really being aware that I will have blind spots and I will make mistakes and I will be unaware, and really focusing on building relationships with and bringing in people who are experts in the lived experience, who are impacted by my work. So for me, I do more work with the Latino or Latinx community and autism. So I think relationship building, seeking to bring in perspectives, paying people for their time. And I know another question we have is about the challenges, and there are a lot of challenges I can also share that I've learned from, but maybe I'll just leave it there for now, that's kind of my primary way of trying to practice anti-racism.
Right. I 100% agree. And I will say, I'll just sort of piggyback on that. I love that you mentioned, you know, being aware that you'll have blind spots. We all do. There's no way to know everyone's individual experience. And so, you know, again, people are always so worried about saying the wrong thing. And it's like, yeah, you're gonna say the wrong thing. That is okay. And in fact, I found in my experience, I don't know about you all, but those moments are more profound. I learned so much more from those moments as opposed to the ones where it's like I'm preaching to the choir. I'm saying all the right things and everybody's like nodding their head, right? Which is great. It makes me feel good. But like, are we making progress? You know, are we building bridges, sharing experiences, learning? So anyways, I'll come off of my soapbox and hear from the rest of you all.
I was going to add that if we're not acknowledging that we could make mistakes, if we're not acknowledging, excuse me, that we don't know everything, then we're walking on eggshells, and the possibility of building a relationship with someone, either someone who you want to include in a research study or someone that you want to work with providing treatment or working with on advocacy or bringing in for diagnosis or anything like that. If you're not open to what the person in front of you is experiencing, then there is so much that is lost in terms of what you learn, but also what can be provided to the individual and the family. And I think that is such an important thing for people who are in this field or any field doing any work at all in the world, because this is a multi-racial, multi-ethnic world that we live in. And I don't think we can run away anymore from what is right in front of us and from the fact that the only way for us to really be effective is to acknowledge who and what each of us is and learn from one another. That is how we heal what happens now and how we make it possible for people to access what they need and live the, productive and healthy lives.
Absolutely. That acknowledgement is so key, right? Because that then opens the door for an authentic conversation to be had. Really, it sort of highlights that elephant in the room. Like, let's talk about it, right? Let's get that out there.
Yeah, related to making cultural connection, what I try to do in my research is making the effort to recognize the different types of barriers faced by different groups, and in order to create solutions that are culturally appropriate and sensitive. So I work with Black, Latino, and Korean families in research, and I learned that the barriers in participating in autism research and treatment, it can overlap between groups, but they're also different. So with our Black families, they experience such trauma and pain in this country. So it makes sense that they distrust the medical community, the research community. From my Latino colleague, I learned that there's a concept called machismo, which leads Latino fathers to deny their children's diagnosis, and they don't seek treatment because of that. And also language barriers is a big problem in that community. And with our Korean families, language barriers is a big problem as well, because the majority of Korean Americans are first generation immigrants. And there really aren't many professionals and researchers who are Korean speaking. So their choices in terms of provider availability and research projects that they can participate in is very, very limited. So yeah, recognizing different types of barriers is important, and in making connection with the families.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there are certain barriers that we know kind of exist, right? We've heard of them time and time again. I also think it's important, right, to not assume that for every person, but to sort of, if you have an awareness, like, might this be a thing for you, right? That can be helpful to sort of bring it out. No, if it doesn't matter, if it's not, it doesn't impact that person, great, but at least we talked about it. And then maybe it opens the door for something else that impacts them, right? It's great.
So I'm thinking about my own research because I'm also a part of the community that I work with. I'm a Black mom who has a child with autism, and I work very particularly with Black families that have children with autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders. So, but for me, as both a parent and a researcher, what I find particularly problematic is that we don't have researchers from the community sitting in equitable space. So to often be a non-Black researcher saying, hey, community, come in and be part of this, but there's not an equitable space for them, right? So we need to be pipelining and making it, you have to do the work that Dr. Graham's asking for, right? Which is to tear down the barriers that preclude Black and other people of color from becoming the researchers themselves, and pipelining us into these possibilities, right? Helping us tear down the actual systems that are making this so difficult. I think that's terribly important that we see people of color from the community as the doctors on the research team, not only inputting the questions, but central in the analysis. And then your citation practices have to mirror this as well. If you're only using white academics to think with, to make your analysis about said community, we're in real trouble. And so I would beg you to also think about your citation practices as you're moving through your analysis.
100%. It's true, because there are narratives, right? We are creating the narratives with our research. And if those narratives are only coming through a certain perspective or lens, albeit well-intentioned, then we're likely to get something wrong. And like, how could we not? That's okay that people don't know, but that means that we have to do that extra work to be inclusive and to be responsible, really, right? How can we sort of do these studies or this work with diverse populations when we haven't sort of done that work to include voices from these diverse communities? So, and again, like that's what I love about this moment when we talk about anti-racism, is because it's really calling all of us out, each and every one of us. What are you doing, you know, to train the next generation, or to engage in these difficult conversations, or to listen a little bit harder, to show that much more compassion and empathy, to do a little more for this family across from you who's asking for help, right? This is such a great conversation. Thank you guys so much. So, Dr. Angel, you mentioned some of the barriers or the challenges in doing this work. So I think that sets us up to kind of talk about that. Like, how has this been, talk about cultural humility, how has this been a humbling experience, you know, doing this work? What have you learned from some of the challenges that you faced in trying to engage anti-racism?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is important to share mistakes and kind of the learning process. So for me, I will share that as a student, I heard, okay, include the perspectives of, you know, autistic people, Latinx communities. Okay, I went and sought out a postdoc that was going to teach me community engaged research, participatory research. And I naively thought, oh, I'll just ask. And I had a real struggle with which probably sounds obvious to everyone else, but there's a lot of different voices and perspectives and experiences and opinions and preferences within these communities. And it, to be honest, it slowed me down for a while trying to figure out what to do. And I think part of it was the fear of doing something wrong, as opposed to just approaching it with humility. I will make mistakes, and that's better than not doing the work and not attempting to bring in people to have their input on all phases of the research. Am I even focusing on the right research questions that are important to you? You know, things like, does the community prefer Latino or Latinx? These things matter a lot. You know, the language that we use, autistic or person with autism, and it slowed me down for a while, trying to sort of figure out where I should go in terms of all of these things. And I think in hindsight, that was the fear of saying something wrong or making a mistake. And I've learned to just keep going. The other challenge is relationship building is key. Of course, you guys have all spoken to trust. You've spoken to history of abuse and exploitation in research. And for me, obviously that takes time. And I've moved around several times in academia. So that is something that's still kind of unfolding for me, is getting established and showing that I'm in it for the long run. I'm not here just to get you to help me recruit for this one study. And, you know, another thing that you mentioned at the beginning is these disparities. So another challenge that I found is if I'm looking, let's say, to incorporate a stakeholder group of Latina and Latino autistic adults or young adults, those disparities, you mentioned, Erin, in even how research has played out and recruiting. And so even finding people who are adults based on those disparities from 20 years ago has been a challenge too. And finally, one other challenge to your point, Stephanie, is as a postdoc, I had students reaching out to me, and students who were interested in studying health disparities because they have a vested interest, right? They identify with one or more of the groups who are impacted by the research I'm doing. And I didn't quite know as a postdoc how to best bring students in and mentor them and find a place for them and find roles for them in my lab. And I'm just, as an early career investigator, learning how to do that. But I'm amazed at how many students are so these students are amazing. They come, they want to participate, and this speaks also to the disparities that both of you mentioned in researchers. Are we supporting investigators and mentoring them through so that they can then become researchers leading teams? So that also was a challenge early in my career that I'm still learning, is how to best bring in and mentor and support diverse students who are passionate about addressing these disparities.
Oh my gosh, so many good points you made. I had to start, like, I wanted to take some notes just to sort of comment. You mentioned the time that it takes, right, to nurture these relationships and trust, and to show that we are here for the long run, right? We have to do that to build that trust. And like, you know, we owe that much, right? Like, why should I open up my entire life to you if you're just going to be gone in 60 seconds? Right? You're just going to write up your research report and, you know, have your name in lights or whatever they do, right, in the ivory tower. And then I'm over here still in my, you know, in my same position without any help, right? So you have to sort of show like that you are there and willing to give that time, right? That's so important. And the heterogeneity piece is key. I always say, like, I'm just one Black woman. Like, I am not speaking for all Black people, right? Nor could I. And so acknowledging that each person has their own unique interaction with race and all of these experiences is so key. And then I feel like you were sort of tapping into a sort of label that I heard, or term that was new to me, but an experience that was very familiar, of the minority tax. You know, when it comes to, you know, feeling as a person of color that you're the one who has to mentor all of the people who are interested in this work, and wanting to do that, obviously, right? But sort of feeling like you might be, I don't know that you didn't necessarily say this, Amber, but, you know, maybe feeling like you know, you sort of have to, right? You're the only one who will. And so that's really why I want to highlight this moment of the work that we can all do in that regard, as well. So I'll open it up to anybody else to share challenges or to piggyback on any of these great points that Dr. Angel made.
Yeah, something I found very humbling from working with the community members is that some community organizations and parent groups, they're already doing what researchers should be doing, but not really doing. For example, like offering translations in different languages. And they know how to approach families in a very culturally sensitive way and utilize the preferred method of communication. And they're really creative. And as researchers, we call it a novel method, but it's been around in the community for years. And there's a finding that researchers in translational science like to cite, that it takes 17 years for research findings to reach the community. So when people cite this, it's often implying that while the research is advancing, the community is falling behind. But from working with the families and community organizations, I've come to realize that in some aspects, maybe it's the researchers that are 17 years behind compared to the community. So yeah, I found it very humbling.
That's a really good point. You're right. You know, that really sort of neutralizes that power dynamic, right? And draws attention to the knowledge and experience that communities already have. They're doing the work, grassroots, right? Like, I got this, because they don't have any other choice, right?
But isn't that the anti-racism right there, right? That we don't consider community methods to be actual research methods, or, you know, the knowledge base that we as people of color have accumulated in keeping ourselves safe, right? It's not that we don't want to participate in your research, it's that we have several centuries to this very day teaching us that we have to survive you. And so the safest route for us is not to participate, right? Like, so, you know, and acknowledging that, you know, we as researchers take a very particular, and are taught to take a very particular type of lens towards research. And if you want to do anti-racist work, you indeed are going to have to choose to, like, decenter white supremacy and whiteness and white academia as a method, right? And take on the community's understanding of themselves and the ways in which they're doing their own work, right? As the knowledge, as the research method. So,
Right.
kind of my,
Yeah, partner with them as opposed to feeling like we're doing them some sort of favor by giving all of our academic knowledge. I mean, we have knowledge to share, but we also need to learn a lot, and figure out what's needed, right? How can we be of service? This is great. Thank you guys.
I
so
think
much.
from the treatment perspective, all of these things are absolutely true throughout treatment. All the issues that people have already stated, that not seeing people who look like you coming into your home to talk with you about the kinds of things you're experiencing and the services that you might need, not necessarily sharing all of the information about service and rights and responsibility of agencies that are designed and mandated to provide support to you. And I know that, for me, I remember coming to LA. I originally came from Canada and worked with a diverse population there. But when I came here, my very first job was as a residential service coordinator. And I was taken by my supervisor to a group home that I was going to be the service coordinator for. And the woman who I grew to love, um, her first statement was, "You're not bringing me another white woman, are you?" And I thought, okay, well, this is going to be a challenge for me. And my supervisor happened to be a Black woman. So I was thankful that she was a Black woman because there were questions I had. I was not familiar with a lot of the things that happen here in LA in particular. And I was familiar with other parts of the country. And so, but I learned so much from that woman who taught me about being as open as I needed to be in that situation, and what the kinds of questions I needed to ask and the kinds of things I needed to be aware of. And I mean, I was just, when I first got there, I just thought, oh my God, what am I going to do now? I mean, she clearly doesn't even want anything to do with me. Of course, I understood why, to some degree, because I wasn't a Black woman experiencing what she was experiencing as a Black woman. But it was the beginning of extreme learning for me that was different than what I had already experienced in my work in Canada. And it made me just so aware of all that I did not know. And I think as I continue to work here in Los Angeles, the work that I did with communities of color really was reinforced by the beginnings and by each of the people that I came in contact with, helping people to really be able to access what they needed and walking through some of those fires that people have to walk through from the point of advocacy, but also working with people so that they could advocate for themselves, so that they understood what was there for them and how to support one another through this with the help of others. And so I think each time I encountered the incredible, the barriers, the racism, the lack of confidence that families had because of their prior experiences, it taught me more, it made me more humble, and it motivated me to fight even harder. And I think that as I work with others and we're training them within the regional center system, that kind of information was really important to share with them and help them to be more open and less fearful of what might happen if they were honest about their bias or their fear or any of that, because nothing would change otherwise.
Right. Yeah, it's
And I'm still learning. It
right.
never ends. There's always someone else has a different experience that helps you in that regard as well.
Exactly. This work is ongoing, right?
Yeah.
We can't stop thinking that we're going to reach some sort of pinnacle. Like, okay, finally, I got it. I'm woke, right? It's like, nope, keep working, keep learning. It's an ongoing process because each person is going to have their own unique experience, right? And you really bring up advocacy and how important that is. And I think that that's what, because I don't want not white people, I'll just say. I don't want people to walk away feeling like, oh, because like I'm white, like I can never connect, or, you know, I can't get it. I think people just want to experience care and compassion, know that you are there with them, and that even if you don't know their story, you're in this with them to listen and to help, to be of service. And when you talk about sort of walking through the fires with them, um, that goes such a long way. Like, yes, we do need to have more diverse professionals. Let's be clear, that's important. But it doesn't mean that because you don't represent this particular community that you can't be helpful. You just need to demonstrate that compassion, that to show that, you know, they can trust you, you know, that you're not going to leave them hanging or exploit them. That goes such a long way. And, you know, Sorrel, it sounds like you've been doing that work for a really, really long time. So thank you for that. I do want to get in some of the audience questions that came in. Thank you all for sending those questions in. We have a couple of, or at least a couple, I'm sure maybe more, of educators in the audience. And so one of the questions was, how can educators provide feedback effectively to students who struggle with empathy? And she goes on, he or she, or they, sorry, goes on to say, recently a student who I work with was discussing the anniversary of George Floyd's murder with a peer, and their response was, "It's been a year, get over it already." Our program is diverse, but often avoids discussing or correcting this behavior. My fear is one day our students will say statements like this out loud and someone unfamiliar with their deficits react unkindly and or aggressively. So, you know, again, people often want sort of these practical tips, like, what do you do? You know, what do you say? How do you handle that when someone is clearly not being empathetic, compassionate, all the things that we just talked about? Any ideas for how to navigate that?
I think
I think
if
fascinating.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Stephanie.
I mean, the question itself is fascinating because it's left unmarked. It's racially unmarked. There's no such thing as students and then saying that you have a diverse population in the United States, right? Like, we have a diverse, well, which students are doing this type of hurting to which students? And what type of care are you providing the students who've now been impacted by those type of microaggressions, right? Like, you have to get even to the root of the question and who you're willing to mark as what and who you're not, and why we leave things racially unmarked, so we can even provide you with possible solutions, right? Like, and that's how deep the racism is, right? Like, that's how insidious racism is that it's even laid out inside of these kind of quiet ways in which we choose or choose not to like address race, even in the framing of a question. And I think that's, I know that's maybe not the answer you're looking for, but it's the place you have to start if you really intend to do the work of anti-racism, right?
Calling it out, right?
I think you're absolutely right, Stephanie. I also think that when working with people with autism, a lot of the focus is on teaching people skills, helping people understand what empathy is, or what do you do to be a friend? How do you respond to people in the world? And so I think in addition to looking at the root of the issue, there is also, I think, the need for these kinds of conversations to happen with people on the spectrum, as we do teach other kinds of social skills, if you want to call them that. So not to be what's the word, superficial about it at all, but that there starts to be some conversation within groups of kids that really addresses the issues, but also addresses, how do you respond to things like this? What, you know, when someone's feeling like this or experiencing this, what do you say? How do you respond? And of course, there are biases, and there are all kinds of things that people are not aware of, the kids are not aware of, people teaching them aren't aware of. And so the root is important, but also as you're building the foundation, teaching some of the skills that are necessary to be able to navigate these issues is, I think, where you begin. There's a basic conversation that it starts with, and skills that people add to, because they're learning different skills already, this has to be a part of that conversation.
Mhm. Yeah. No, I think, oh, go ahead, Sue, sorry.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say the person who made the comment, I think they're just so far removed from the situation that they just can't relate at all. So maybe start with somebody very close, like their classmates, have a discussion of, what they see on news actually happens to their friends, neighbors, classmates. So maybe there should be a discussion group during class where, the peers open up about how, some of those comments or some of those events that people see on the news are actually affecting their everyday life. And maybe the person who made that insensitive comment will realize, oh, I should be really careful. It's actually impacting my friends. Maybe they need to learn that.
Mhm. Yeah, I have what might be a sort of, and I know we need to wrap up. I'm mindful of the time, and I have one more question that I want to get in, but I also wanted to comment on this. I don't know if this is sort of a controversial stance or not. I'd be curious to hear from you all, but my thought about this is to sort of model empathy, which may mean leaning into unpopular opinions, like right now we're all talking about this topic of, anti-racism and what's socially acceptable. But I I always have a perhaps morbid curiosity when people say things like that. I want to learn more, again, sort of coming from this perspective of sort of shared experience or sharing knowledge and experience, because I think that when we talk to one another, we can kind of find a common ground. It might be hard to imagine, like, I don't see how we're going to meet eye to eye on this, but at least airing this out. Let's lean into that. Okay, tell me more about why you feel that way. Now let's hear more about why this person feels this way. Hear it all, air it all out, and maybe see if some change can be made or some progression can be had. I don't know if that's a controversial opinion or not, but I think that sort of shutting it down, that just sort of silences what's there. And I think it's important to hear it, in full color, and then have a conversation about it. So that's just my 2 cents. Go
I
ahead.
think shutting it down is how we got here in the first place, right? If we're shutting it down all the time, then we never get anywhere and there isn't a conversation. So
Right. And it's not to justify it or anything, but just sort of, again, just leaning into the conversation, right? So that these things are out and we can learn from one another. Stephanie?
I feel like I mean, if it's fine if you want to have the conversation, as long as the person of color doesn't have to do the work of like the emotional labor of this and or the standing there to listen to the racism. And we're constantly finding new ways to give breath and space for this racism to exist and keep proliferating. And we're literally sitting here making arguments about why we're going to do that. Like, let's hear this argument. Well, it's another racist argument. We have centuries of this. So like, we kind of know what's going on, right? Like, and so my opinion would be like, cool, you want to have them conversations? Great. Take that into a space where people of color will not be touched by it. And then you have that conversation to yourselves.
Yeah.
But you leave my child out of it, you leave my body out of it, because we know that the impacts of racism have adverse health effects. They literally kill us. So I would advocate maybe not so much, but that's just my point of view.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Re-traumatization is real, and so I hear that as well. Thank you. Okay, we only have 3 minutes, but what I really wanted to, oh, well, I don't know if we have time. Do I need to stop you all? Somebody stop me if I need to. I don't know if Lauren or whoever is there. Oh, yes. Should I stop?
I think it's okay if you want to ask your final question. We'll wrap up after that. And the information about the evaluation is in the chat for folks who need to jump off.
Thank you. Yeah, so my last question, I have it highlighted. This is the last question, end on this, is what motivates you to continue doing this work, right? It's hard. We've talked about the challenges and, the differing opinions on how to go about it as well, and the likelihood of making mistakes and flubbing it up. So what motivates you to continue doing this difficult and consistent work we've talked about. We have to keep going. We can't stop, that anti-racism requires.
If I'm speaking about the Korean American community, I push myself to continue this work because honestly, I don't know who else is going to do the work until I find someone else who can share the burden. But until then, I know I'm going to have to continue and make the voice of Korean families to be heard to researchers. And also, I'll continue to work with other communities because I think it's really important to make good allies. So we work with Latino and African American communities too, but when in times of help, we have to help each other out. And when we face injustice, we have to speak up for them, be a good friend. Yeah, so that's why I continue to the work.
I think what motivates me is the fact that there isn't a person who doesn't deserve to have their needs met, period. And every time I see that we succeed at having one more person get what they need and be able to start walking a path that is healthier and more productive for themselves, families not in distress as they were, that's what motivates me, one by one by one. And of course, working on a larger scale as well. It's just as I am able to be with people across different communities and participate in things like the research that's been done through AIRB and be involved in work groups with different community agencies, I just feel like that's making a contribution to making life better for people. That I am aware of my own privilege, and I don't think I should be walking around privileged in that way. I feel like everyone deserves to be able to get what they need. That's what motivates me every day.
Yeah. And the work can be really rewarding, right? When you really dig in. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I think the motivation for me is clearly, as a Black mother of a Black child, that given all your data, Dr. Gray, I mean, the outcome possibilities are horrifying for my child, right? And I love Black people, and I love watching Black families love their children so fiercely. And my liberation is tied to our liberation as a collective Black people. And so for me, the work is deeply personal, right? Is to provide my son a future and his sister who will inherit his care, a future where they get equitable access to life and supports and the good life, right? So.
Yeah, I'm hearing that from, Sue and Stephanie. It's like, we have no choice. Like, these are our people. Like, it benefits me to help us, right? And what's interesting is that it benefits all of us to help one another, right? Again, like, what can we say that we know when we're not including everybody? And when we're not including the knowledge that everybody has? It's like there's so much untapped information. So it doesn't even have to be a direct one-to-one if we can kind of open up, like, we will all benefit from this. Yeah. Dr. Angel?
Yeah, very briefly, I mean, an ethical motivation for sure. If we want to do good research, if we want to do good clinical practice, we have to, so once I learned about history of abuse and exploitation, and it's also that way, your research is focusing on what's important and what will make it change. But the bottom line, just an ethical motivation to not do more harm and to help.
Right. Thank you all so much. I loved this conversation. I appreciate you all for joining me in it. Thank you to the audience for your questions. I'll say what motivates me of many things is conversations like these. you know, each time I have these conversations, it feels like progress, and I feel inspired. I feel invigorated to continue. So that's why I wanted to have a dialogue, because it really fuels me to continue and to learn from you all. So thank you for participating in that with me. And with that, I'll turn it over to close out to the team.
Thank you to our wonderful presenter and panelists. This was a really wonderful presentation and discussion. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you again for attending. We hope to see you soon.